Well, hello and welcome to our Bible study today. My name is David Matthews. I'm here with Nancy Springer, and we are priests in the Anglican Episcopal Communion. I'm in the Diocese of Toronto, and Nancy is down in Texas. Now, Nancy, I have to confess, I can't remember which diocese in Texas technically you're in right now.
Well, there's several, and they all have Texas in their name. But technically, I am in the Diocese of West Texas, which geographically is South Texas, which is a whole other story.
That is not confusing at all. But Nancy and I have known each other since seminary and are good friends, and we're just very blessed to be able to, through the use of technology, continue on both our study of scripture as well as just our friendship as well. So it's always great to, of course, study the Bible with a friend. You don't always agree with them, but you do get challenged by their word and encouraged by their spirit too. So we're very glad to be able to do this together.
Yes, we are. And that, right, I just want to second that, the encouragement that happens in doing this together. We're going to get into some really challenging texts, chapters over the next several chapters. And it's often this type of thing that makes us just stop reading altogether. It's harsh. It doesn't sound pleasant to the ear. But it's important in understanding who God is and who we are as God's children. And so we have to stick with it. And when you do it with a friend, it makes it a little easier to wrestle with because you have company and someone to bounce ideas off of. So I just encourage all of you to stick with us and keep going. Don't give up. We will keep pointing out the glimmers of hope as we go through this tension of holding God's justice and God's mercy together in tension, knowing that both are characteristics of God. All right. And I will quit talking and start reading now. We're going to start with chapter 13 of Isaiah.
And we're going through to chapter 14, verse 23. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. So we're reading from the Common English Bible. Mm-hmm. An oracle about Babylon, which Isaiah, Amos's son, saw. On a bare mountain, raise a signal. Cry aloud to them. Wave a hand. Let them enter the officials' gates. I have commanded my holy ones. I have called my warriors, my proud, jubilant ones, to execute my wrath. Listen, a roar on the mountains like that of a great crowd. Listen, an uproar of kingdoms, of nations coming together. The Lord of heavenly forces is mustering an army for battle. They are coming from a distant land, from the faraway heavens. The Lord and the instruments of his fury to destroy the whole land. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. Like destruction from the Almighty it will come. Then all hands will fall limp. Every human heart will melt, and they will be terrified. Like a woman writhing in labor, they will be seized by spasms and agony. They will look at each other aghast, their faces blazing. Look, the day of the Lord is coming with cruel rage and burning anger, making the earth a ruin and wiping out its sinners. Heaven's stars and constellations won't show their light. The sun will be dark when it rises. The moon will no longer shine. I will bring disaster upon the world for its evil, and bring their own sin upon the wicked. I will end the pride of the insolent, and the conceit of tyrants I will lay low. I will make humans scarcer than fine gold, people rarer than the gold of Ophir. I will rattle the heavens. The earth will shake loose from its place because of the rage of the Lord of heavenly forces on the day his anger burns. They will be like hunted gazelles, like sheep without a shepherd. All will turn to their own people and flee to their own lands. Whoever is found will be stabbed. Whoever is caught will fall by the sword. Their infants will be crushed before their eyes, their houses plundered, their women raped. Look, I'm rousing the Medes against them. The Medes pay no mind to silver, no desire for gold. Their bows will smash youths. They will be merciless to newborns, pitiless to children. So Babylon, a jewel among kingdoms, the Chaldeans' splendor and pride, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah, destroyed by God. No one will ever resettle or live there for generations. No Arab will camp there. No shepherds will rest flocks there. Wild cats will rest there. Houses will be filled with owls. Ostriches will live there, and goat demons will dance there. Hyenas will howl in its strongholds, and jackals in its luxurious places. Babylon's time is coming soon. Its days won't drag on.
The Lord will have compassion on Jacob, will again choose Israel, and will give them rest in their own land. Immigrants will join them and attach themselves to the house of Jacob. The peoples will take them and bring them to their own place. The house of Israel will possess them as male and female slaves in the Lord's land, making captives of their captors and ruling their oppressors. When the Lord has given you rest from pain and trouble, from the hard labor that you perform, you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. How the oppressor has ceased, how the flood has receded. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the rod of tyrants that struck people in rage with ceaseless blows, that ruled nations with anger, with relentless aggression. All the earth rests quietly, then it breaks into song. Even the cypresses rejoice over you, the cedars of Lebanon. Since you were laid low, no logger comes up against us. The underworld beneath becomes restless to greet your arrival. It awakens the ghosts, all the leaders of earth. It makes the kings of the nations rise from their thrones. All of them speak and say to you, even you've become weak like we are. You are the same as us. Your majesty has been brought down to the underworld along with the sound of your harps. Under you is a bed of maggots, and worms are your blanket. How you've fallen from heaven, morning star, son of dawn. You are cut down to earth, helpless on your back. You said to yourself, I will climb up to heaven, above God's stars. I will raise my throne. I'll sit on the mount of assembly, on the heights of Zaphon. I'll go up to the cloud tops. I'll be like the Most High. But down to the underworld, you are brought to the depths of the pit. Those who see you will stare at you. They will examine you closely. Is this the man who rattled the earth, who shook kingdoms, who made the world a wasteland and tore down its cities and wouldn't let his prisoners go home? All the kings of the nations lie down honored, all of them, each in his own tomb. But you are cast away from your own grave like a rejected branch, covered by the dead and those pierced by the sword, who go down to the stormy pit like a trampled corpse. You won't join them in burial, for you destroyed your own land, you killed your own people. Such evil offspring will never be mentioned again. Prepare a place to slaughter his sons for the guilt of their father. Don't let them arise to take over the earth or fill the world with cities. I will arise against them, says the Lord of heavenly forces. I will cut off Babylon's renown and remnant, offshoot and offspring. I will make it a home of herons, a swampland. I will sweep it away with the broom of destruction, says the Lord of heavenly forces. All right.
I keep waiting for you to say the word of the Lord.
The word of the Lord. I know,
Thanks
I
be to
almost
God.
said it. Well, let's just agree here and now to always say it.
Sounds good to me. There you go. So Nancy, we're doing this a little bit different. This section, as we're moving into a number of statements in judgment, oracles against nations, and so we're breaking this up, and we're not asking our usual questions if we have usual questions, but we're organizing this a little bit differently. And so one of the things I'm going to be doing for a bit of this is talking a little bit about the history, and Nancy's going to be talking a little bit about the theology of it as well, and sort of about what this means to both us as people, but more importantly, what does this say about God's character? And so these ones are going to be a little bit shorter as we talk about individual oracles against nations and peoples, as that's how we feel that this section is broken up. Now, there are caveats in here, as we're going to talk about in a little bit, about sections that don't seem to necessarily connect with one or another. And so we are just going to connect them and talk about why perhaps we did, or why we just, quite frankly, don't know where it should go. But is that fair, Nancy?
That sounds great.
All right. So to start us off, a little bit of the history. This section is a little bit problematic. And it's not problematic, of course, just because of what it says about God's character and judgment. I know we as New Testament Christians aren't always comfortable with that. Nancy will talk about that a little bit more. But it's also problematic chronologically. The book of Isaiah, people have talked about maybe there were multiple authors, or maybe it spanned over, many, many years of being written and compiled later. And that part is certainly true. The multiple authors, some people argue yes, some people argue no. But this text is a problem. And the reason it's a problem is because it's talking about the downfall of Babylon. And if this book were to be compiled chronologically, then the problem is that we are still looking at the point where Assyria hasn't even reached its zenith of power yet. It is certainly the most powerful nation in the world, in their world at this point in time, Assyria. But Babylon at this point hasn't risen to power. So why are they talking about a condemnation of Babylon, a destruction of Babylon, when Babylon at some point after, like if this is if this is in chronicle order.
Logical.
Thank you. I kept saying the word, and I'm like, that's not right. Chronological, thank you. Order. If it is, then Babylon still needs to rise to power after this. So this is a little bit difficult for people. However, this is again a oracle against Babylon. Now I say against, but there are parts that do bring that into question, because it says an oracle about Babylon at the beginning. But in verse 3, it says, I've commanded my holy ones, I've called my warriors, my proud jubilant ones, to execute my wrath. So is this actually a statement that God is condemning Babylon? Or is it also a statement in which God is going to rise up Babylon? So if it is that second option, it might make sense as to why it is situated here. So chronologically, get that word right, what we're going to presume or suggest is that this is written during the time when the nation of Assyria, it sits above the northern and then the southern kingdom. And there's also a country here, or a kingdom here, called Syria as well. And these are the four, if you will, big areas. Now, just to the east of Judah, across the lake, is the nation of Moab, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. And to its west, there is the nation, southwest, it's the nation of Philistia, where the Philistines come from. So those two nations we're going to talk about in a little bit, but just to give you the geography. So if we were to look at this historically, then Babylon comes to power when Assyria falls. They are the reason Assyria falls. But Assyria falls in 612 when its nation's capital, Nineveh, gets conquered by the Babylonians. And they do this by teaming up with a people group called the Medes, which are, if Assyria is here and Babylon is, Judah is to the south, then to the east of Assyria, following the river down, the Euphrates, you get to the nation of Babylon. Now you keep following that river down and you keep going east, you get to the nation that is later called Persia, where the Medes and the Persians live. So Babylon teams up with, I know this is getting long, sorry folks. Babylon teams up with the Medes at this point in order to beat up on the Assyrians. This is sort of how Assyria falls. The thing is, Babylon also, though, is they themselves will later be conquered by the Medes and the Persians. So what happens is Assyria up north starts to conquer everybody, or influence them. It is called hegemony or hegemony. Influence them and ultimately make them pay tribute or taxes to Assyria. So first they go south and they go to the nations of Syria and to the northern kingdom. And they, at this point in time, they start to influence the southern kingdom as well. And that's what some of these prophecies in a little bit are going to be referencing. But Babylon at this moment is, Assyria then turns around and attacks Babylon. And they actually capture the city of Babylon somewhere between the year 704 and 681. It's during a King Sennacherib's reign. So they get conquered during that, and it's another 70-ish years until they revolt, and they in turn conquer their oppressors. So there's a bit of a shift in power around all of this time. It's a very tumultuous time. And of course, this is the time in which the prophet Isaiah is writing. So it's empire against empire, nation rising against nation, and it's an absolutely incredible thing. Now, this is also what the prophecies of Daniel talk about as well, point to, when Daniel has the vision of the different animals, and he talks about Assyria, he talks about Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, and ultimately prophesies of the Greeks coming. Here's the second problem, putting this in a chronological place. Commentators, if I were to talk about the fall of the largest empire in the world today, the most powerful nation, the United States, if I were to talk about that, and then 50 years from now, 100 years, it were to happen, and then 200 years after that, someone were to see my video and it didn't have a timestamp on it, somebody might say, well, obviously he wrote during the time it happened and he's just giving a commentary on what's happening, and rather than actually seeing something coming. Don't get me wrong, I love the country of the United States, but as history has shown us, all nations rise and fall. And so I'm sure it will not be the most powerful nation in the entire world for the rest of God's time. I'm sure there are some Pentecostals out there who will tell me Jesus will come back first. And you know what? I hope Jesus comes today and cuts this video short. If he doesn't, though, then we'll continue on the day after. I'm not actually joking about that. Like, I really would wish that he just would come right now. But that's a side note. Until he does, we'll continue to talk about his word and encourage people to get to know him until that day. So I think I'm kind of covered in talking about the history here, the difficulty in placing this chronologically, but at the same time, it is important to note that God can speak, and people can look forward in time and say, you know what, logically, the next most powerful nation, if this nation were to fall today, would be this other nation that is nearby that is also powerful. That's not too much of a stretch of the imagination. So I personally don't see the problem with chronologically putting this in around the year, 740 to 720. I don't have a problem with that. Other people do. So, I encourage you to study, read it for yourself, and, figure it out yourself.
Yeah.
But Nancy, that's kind of what I can give you historically about it. I would just like to point to one or two key texts that I thought were very important here. And it's like verse 17, where it says, look, I'm rousing the Medes against them. The Medes pay no mind to silver, no desire for gold. And so the Medes, again, are basically the Medes and the Persians that will one day conquer Babylon. So again, this could be looking forward, something pointed out by God. Don't know. Again, in verse 19, it says, so Babylon, a jewel among kingdoms, the Chaldeans, just so you know, so Babylon is the city, and consequently the nation is named, or the empire is named after the city, similar to the Roman Empire. But the Chaldeans are the people group that live there. So the Chaldean splendor and pride will become like Sodom and Gomorrah, destroyed by God. So again, remember, Sodom and Gomorrah are the historic examples in the Jewish people's mindset. Shouldn't call them Jewish at this point. The Israelites' mindset of God's destruction of a city and of a people. And again, Ezekiel talks about Sodom and Gomorrah as being destroyed because of their selfishness. They're hoarding of wealth, basically, and not being charitable. The book of Jude, written many, many years later, actually talks about it because of their sexuality. So those are two different points as to why the city of Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. But be that as it may, it resonated very strongly in the mindset of the people of Israel that it was God's action that did it. And so the point being, again, it's God who's going to bring judgment upon Babylon. Lastly, just as a point of a comment here, is that it does talk about the, pardon me, it does talk about the constellations going dark. And one of the interesting points to note, of course, is that the people at this time looked at the constellations as their gods or as symbols of their god's power or direction. People divine the stars for God's guidance. And so by those going dark was a representation of their gods being cut off from them. One of the criticisms against the Jewish people coming up is actually going to be about their abandonment of God himself and their seeking of power in other places. So again, here it's as if God is cutting off the power of Babylon from their gods. And so it's only going to be, again, this recognition of, similar to Egypt and the Israelites under Moses, who has more power. And the 10 Commandments are basically God showing, I'm more powerful than this Egyptian God and this Egyptian God and this, and I'll go through all 10 and I'll show you who's more powerful. Not that there were only 10 Egyptian gods, but all 10 commandments. And so that's historically the people would have clearly seen or understood God saying this is going to happen, and the person that's bringing it about is him. So that's my I was going to say historicity. That's not a word.
Historicity.
Yes, that's my comment on the history of it. And yeah, Nancy, do you want to take it away and talk a little bit about the theology that this shows about the character of God?
I would love to, but first I have 2 points because I just didn't want to interrupt you. You were on a great roll there. You need your whiteboard, Dave. Dave couldn't ever do anything in seminary without his whiteboard. He carried one with him.
I did. It wasn't a small one either. It was like 5 feet by 4 feet. I carried it around the school. Not to classes, but awesome. To when we went to study in the library.
To study groups and stuff. Yeah. So yes, Dave needs a whiteboard to talk. He did well in that lecture without his whiteboard. And just to call to mind all of the many evenings we sat in the chapel wishing Jesus would come right that moment so we didn't have to take whatever exam was waiting for us the next day.
Or finish whatever paper we were on.
Yeah. Right. That was great. So yeah, I want to kind of go back to what I started to say at the beginning. I got so excited, I just almost went into my spiel before we even began. But these are important in understanding who God is. We have to read through them and wrestle with them. We have them. They have been preserved through time for our edification, and we can't just ignore what they say. There is historical reference that ground these stories in reality, in historical times and places. These are the people through whom God did God's work, and God continues to work in the world through his own creation and through the people he has created. And so this is all part of our faith ancestry that we need to know about. And it gives us, I think, in comparison and juxtaposition, two very important characteristics of who God is. God is a just God. God seeks justice in situations. And to seek justice means to hold all involved equally accountable for their behavior and for what they've done, good and bad, right? Justice involves both sides in the spectrum between good and evil, but it is holding people accountable for their behavior and having everyone be responsible for what they are to do. And God is truly a just God and has promised since the fall that at some point in time, when God sees the time is right, he will set all things back in proper order, the order that we as human beings through our own free will broke and damaged. We also know that God is a very merciful God, and that's the God we really prefer, right? To have mercy is to not give us the punishment we deserve, to withhold the deserved punishment for our own behavior. And we like to talk about the merciful God, because we don't want to be held accountable for our bad behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say this: we do want the God of justice, of course, when it's somebody else being mean to us.
Else.
When someone else is being mean to us, I want that God of justice. And bring me justice now, Lord. Be merciful, of course, to me, but just as well to when they're bad.
That's right. So we have these two very real characteristics of God, but God can't do them both at the same time, right? If he's going to hold these countries that worship other gods and do the evil things that he is labeling them as doing, if he's going to be a just God, he's got to hold them accountable, right? He can't also be merciful at that same moment. And it's God's choice as to when to do one and when to do the other. You brought up, right, that the 10 plagues in Egypt, where God says, I'm going to prove to the whole universe who I am with these plagues. I'm going to show them so that without a doubt. And that's what is happening here too, right? God is stepping forward and saying, I am the God of everything, even those that don't follow me. And so he is making his power known. But he is holding them justly accountable. So we get to chapter 13, verse 11. He says, I will bring disaster upon the world for its evil. I will bring their own sin upon the wicked, right? So he is basically following the do unto others that we are told, right? Which can go both ways. So God is saying it is through your own sin, through your own evil, that you will ultimately be destroyed. Right? If you live by the sword, you will die by the sword. And this is the justice God that we find in our 21st century Western world to sound so very harsh. And yet the punishments are appropriate for the crimes in chapter 14 when we get to verse 13 and 14, right? So this Babylon has attempted to set itself above all powers, even God's, right? So the leader of Babylon has said, I will climb up to heaven. Above God's stars, I will raise my throne. And so the leaders of Babylon who have attempted to place themselves even higher than God will be brought to the very lowest of lows. And so it is totally appropriate. I mean, Jesus himself says the first shall be last and the last shall be first, right? So those that seek earthly power will lose it, because in God's kingdom, God is the ultimate power and everyone else is equal. And so it is punishment appropriate, and God's setting things right as God intends to do. And so we just have to read through these texts holding those two characteristics of God in tension with each other, right? When does God choose to be merciful and when does God choose to be just? Because God is both, and we can't lose sight of each of those and just ignore these difficult texts and speed past them. We just have to stop and ask ourselves the questions, what can we learn about God and who we are in these hard words?
Absolutely. One thing I would add to that, if I may, is just an illustration. I used to work when I was younger with a troubled boys' home, and it was dealing with some kids who had obviously difficult pasts, and they had become wards of the state, some of them, and some kids were sent there for difficult backgrounds. One of them was there because there was an incident where he had molested his sister. And so the question here is that I would pose, we might look at these statements as them being harsh, God's being harsh. But if you're a parent and you have two children, and one molests the other. One does something really horrible to the other. And I'm sorry if this is a difficult topic for anybody to hear, but that's, I think, in part because our modern Western mindset doesn't have this as a norm anymore. Similar to during the Middle Ages, why there's so much drawings about death is because there was so much death because of the Black Plague. It was just an accepted normal part of life. And I would suggest that maybe God is talking so harshly about his actions because what we consider normal, reasonable behavior would have been completely foreign to the people at this time. So this idea of what do you do when you have two children and one is doing something horrific to another child and will not stop no matter how much you've tried to get them, how much you've tried to restrain them or anything else. At some point you have to act, and act with finality at a certain point. And so maybe that's why this is happening.
Yeah, that's a great way to bring it into a topic that we can understand, right, of parents dealing with their children. Because even though countries like Babylon did not honor God, they are still God's creation, and they are still God's children in God's eyes.
Mm-hmm. And as we talked about last week, that the Holy Spirit was still present in the world, bringing people to a revelation of who God was wherever they are.
Yeah.
So Nancy, do you have anything left you'd like to add about this oracle or about Babylon at this point?
I think that's about it.
Okay.
For that one, we get now to this piece we're not really sure where to put, so we're putting it here. Maybe Isaiah had that same problem. He had this nifty thing, didn't know what to do with it, so he just stuck it in here as he was editing his work here.
Great.
All right. Do you want me to read this one, or would you like to read these?
Why don't you go ahead and read it? You read, yeah, I think I read more than you last time.
All right, so we are in Isaiah chapter 14, and I'm going to start reading in verse 24 and read verses 24 through 27. So it's very short. The Lord of heavenly forces has promised, as I intended, so it will be, and as I have planned, so it will happen. I will break Assyria in my land, on my mountains I will trample it and remove its yoke from my people. His burden will be taken from their shoulders. This is the plan that has been made for all the earth. This is the hand extended over all the nations. The Lord of heavenly forces has created a plan. Who can stop it? God's hand is extended. Who will stop it? The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
All right. So Dave, what makes this one so challenging, these 4 short verses being stuck here between the oracle, the Babylon, and the next one to come, the Philistines?
Again, the difficulty is that there's no declaration of what this is. We don't know if this was part of the previous oracle or if this is just its own standalone piece, written at some other point, maybe a scrap of paper, who knows. But it does have its own clear points. And again, this is now a statement in verse 25, I will break Assyria in my land, on my mountains, I will trample it and remove its yoke from my people. So again, where do you put this? Well, Babylon obviously hasn't crushed Assyria yet, but it's about the proclamation of Assyria being defeated. So presumably Assyria is still in power. Now, Assyria at this time, again, I'm going to put this somewhere between the year 740 and 722. The reason is because in 722, we've got the year of the northern kingdom falling to Assyria, being conquered by them. And so we think it's before that. But at the same time, it's probably not earlier than 740. And again, this is number 7. We're talking BC, before Christ. So that means that the higher number is actually later in time than the lower number. So sorry, folks, a little confusing. So this one is again about Assyria's destruction. The thing is, Assyria was at this point, if this is this time frame, in one of a couple situations. So they were trying to grow their influence, and by influence you mean who you could tax and make follow your laws, and who you could get levies from or armies from. And so they had made treaties with, Assyria, not Assyria, but the separate nation of Syria, just to the south of Assyria, not at all confusing, had made a treaty with the northern kingdom. These are the two nations directly south of Assyria. And they wanted Judah to join in with them to fight Assyria. And so, because they wanted their independence. And so Judah turns around and says, no, 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 I'm not going to do that. And this is where the prophet, from when we talked about in Isaiah chapter 7, tells him to test the Lord and to call out. And he refuses, and so God punishes him. Instead, it's not very explicit in chapter 7, but it's not just that he refuses to test the Lord. What he does instead is, instead of trusting in the Lord to help Judah defend against the northern kingdom and Syria, instead what they do is they actually side with the Assyrians, and they call to the Assyrians for help, and they basically pincer the other two nations, and Assyria defeats them. As I said, in 722, they completely wipe out the northern kingdom. But it's over this time frame this happens, and then of course there's now nothing between the superpower and this tiny little nation left of Judah. So now, of course, they are, if you will, the next thing on the menu. So in all of this, they just continue to face problem after problem. And so God is saying, look, Assyria, I am going to ultimately crush. And they've talked about, or we pointed out the possibility that God is going to use the Babylonians. Historically, we know he does. But we've looked at the possibility that's what it's saying in chapter 13. So it looks like this section could fit here. Does it? I don't know. It sounds good. It's as good a place to put it as any. I'll put it that way.
I think Isaiah was sitting in a pub and had a brilliant thought and scribbled it on a cocktail napkin and stuck it in his pocket, and then figured out where to put it. For me, it's just an aside almost to remind us that God's the one in charge of all this, right? The God who created all the people and all the nations is the one who is orchestrating what is happening here, right? And so it's like, back in the day when all church services were done in Latin and nobody could understand it because nobody spoke Latin. And so to get the people's attention when something important was happening up front, they would ring the bells, which is why we have bells in church, right? And so we ring the Sanctus bells to get everybody's attention and reorient everybody towards the altar and towards God's table. And so I think this is just one of those little, hey, let's keep our eye on God and who God is. And it goes back to what you pointed out a couple of sessions ago, right? This image of God extending his hand. Now, it can be extended in justice, where God's going to hand out punishment. But God's hand is also extended in mercy and in grace, right? And so there is statement after statement in the oracles about this destruction will happen, but the remnant will be cared for, right? The remnant will be taken care of. And so this God extending both the hand of justice and mercy we're reminded of that in this little aside.
I think that's great. I wish you hadn't said that, though, about the bells, because I'm worried that people from my congregation are going to listen to this and be like, how come we don't have bells?
Ring some bells, David. And that's the great thing about the Anglican communion, right? Is we all worship in what fits our community. So some have bells and some don't.
Yeah, it's true. So yeah, I look at this, and the one thing that really stands out to me is verse 26, where it says, "This is the plan that has been made for all the earth, not some of the earth, all the earth." And just a reminder that God's judgment, when he brings it, isn't about God's feelings have been hurt and therefore he wants to hurt you back, but it's a
Right.
reminder that God's judgment is for justice. God's judgment is actually to bring mercy. And that's an important point to remember. Okay, Nancy, that's all I've got for this. Do you have anything that we have yet to cover?
I think that's it.
All right. Well, folks, we're very glad that you're able to join us today. And we will be doing the same thing through the different oracles of this section, chapters 13 through 23. There's always something to learn about what God is doing in the Old Testament, and specifically about that, what that means to us as New Testament Christians and people. So I do hope you continue to follow along. If, however, you do think to yourself, ugh, this is a little bit too much judgment, I want to skip through, Nancy and I will be doing a summary video at the end of all of this regarding all of the different oracles and what they mean to us as Christians today, what we can see about his character. So I hope you come back and you join us again next week as we continue our study, looking at the oracles against Philistia, the Philistines, and against the nation of Moab. Have a great week and God bless.
Bye.